My parents didn't lose me in a crowd. They didn't accidentally fail me. They packed my clothes into a small blue suitcase, drove me across California, signed papers at a children's home, and left me there because my twin sister was smarter than me. But 18 years later, those same parents sat in my dining room smiling proudly, pretending they had always loved me. And that was the moment I finally decided they were going to face the truth they spent half their lives hiding. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, treated like you weren't good enough, or forced to prove your worth to people who should have loved you unconditionally, then this story is going to hit hard. So hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for one of the most emotional and satisfying Reddit revenge stories you'll hear today. My name is Elena Brooks, but when I was born, my last name was Hartley, and in the Hartley family, love was never unconditional. Love was performance-based. You earned it with grades, achievements, trophies, and praise from other people. If you made the family look impressive, you mattered. If you didn't, you became invisible. I learned that lesson long before I was old enough to understand it. I grew up in Palo Alto, California, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. White walls, expensive hardwood floors, huge windows that flooded the kitchen with sunlight every morning. My father, Richard Hartley, owned something called the Hartley Gifted Institute, a private education company that wealthy parents practically worshipped. He coached children for elite academic programs, Ivy League preparation, gifted testing, and prestigious scholarships. My mother, Meredith, worked beside him like a perfectly polished extension of his ego. Together, they built an empire convincing rich families that intelligence was the most important thing a child could possess, and my twin sister Serena was their masterpiece. Serena was brilliant. The kind of child adults talked about in lowered voices like she was something rare and magical. She read books years above her grade level. She solved math problems for fun. Teachers adored her. Parents compared their kids to her. Even strangers looked impressed when she spoke. And me? I froze during tests. My mind would go blank the second a timer started ticking. I could spend hours imagining stories in my head, creating characters, drawing scenes in notebook margins. But none of that mattered in our house. Creativity wasn't considered intelligence there. It was considered distraction. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table one night while my father graded practice exams. Serena sat beside me, calmly solving equations while I stared at a page that looked like it was written in another language. My pencil felt slippery in my hand because my palms were sweating so badly. Why are you stuck again? My father snapped. I swallowed hard. I'm trying. That's the problem, he said coldly. You're always trying. Serena is succeeding. I looked down at the paper while shame crawled up my throat like acid. My mother barely looked at me as she sipped her coffee. Your sister carries the Hartley name beautifully, she said. You make people question it. I was 10 years old. 10. And already I felt like a disappointment sitting beside my own twin. The worst part was, Serena never treated me badly. She never mocked me, never acted superior. When our parents weren't around, she helped me study. She'd sneak snacks into my room after I got grounded for bad grades. Sometimes she'd whisper, "You're not dumb, Lena. Your brain just works differently." But children can't protect each other from adults determined to compare them. The older we got, the worse it became. Everything in our house revolved around achievement. Dinner conversations sounded like performance evaluations. My parents never asked what made us happy. They asked about scores, rankings, awards, competition, results. Every conversation became a silent comparison between Serena and me. If Serena got a 98, my parents celebrated with dessert. If I got a 76, the entire house felt tense for hours. One evening, my father tapped my report card with, his finger so hard the paper bent beneath his nail. "Average," he muttered with disgust. "Average is what happens when a child refuses to rise." I remember staring at that report card while my ears rang. My chest felt tight and heavy, like I couldn't breathe correctly anymore. Because deep down, I already knew something terrifying. My parents loved Serena naturally, but loving me felt like work, and eventually, they stopped wanting to do the work. The year everything finally collapsed, my parents enrolled both of us for entrance testing at one of the most prestigious gifted academies in California. They bragged about it constantly to clients. Their twin daughters were both applying. Their perfect educational methods had supposedly produced 2 exceptional children. But behind closed doors, I was falling apart. Every practice session ended with tears. My father treated panic like weakness. My mother treated anxiety like embarrassment. I'd sit there struggling to focus while Serena quietly finished her work beside me, guilt written all over her face because she knew I was drowning. One night, I broke down crying over a timed math section. "I can't think when the timer's running," I whispered. My father leaned back in his chair and looked at me with complete disappointment. "Then you'll never survive in the real world." The exam day arrived cold and gray. I remember my stomach hurting so badly that morning I thought I might throw up in the car. Serena squeezed my hand before we walked inside. "It's okay," she whispered, but it wasn't okay, not even close. Serena passed effortlessly. I failed so badly the admissions director gently suggested I might thrive better in a less academically intense environment. That single sentence destroyed whatever little patience my parents still had for me. For 2 days, the house became painfully quiet. No yelling, no lectures. Somehow that silence felt even worse. It felt like they were discussing my future behind closed doors while I waited outside my own life. Then on the 3rd night, my mother finally spoke during dinner. "Elena," she said calmly, "pack a small bag tonight. We found a place better equipped to handle your needs." I looked up immediately. "What kind of place?" "A specialized environment," my father answered before she could. "Somewhere with emotional support." I remember feeling confused, but hopeful. Maybe tutoring, maybe counseling, maybe, finally, help. I had no idea my parents were preparing to abandon me. The next morning, they loaded my suitcase into the trunk and drove across the Bay Area in near silence. Serena sat beside me in the back seat, unusually quiet. I noticed her wiping tears away more than once, but nobody explained anything. Then we pulled up outside a large gray building called Harbor House. I stared at the sign while a horrible feeling spread through my stomach. "This?" I whispered. "What is this?" My father turned off the engine. "Get your bag." I still remember the sound my heartbeat made in my ears when we walked inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, overhead. Somewhere down the hallway, a child was crying. A receptionist smiled sadly at me while my parents filled out paperwork. And slowly, the truth began sinking in. This wasn't tutoring. This wasn't temporary help. My parents were leaving me there. I started shaking so hard I could barely breathe. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no. Please." My mother wouldn't look at me. I grabbed her sleeve desperately. "Mom, I'll do better, I swear. I'll study harder." "Elena," she snapped quietly, pulling her arm away. "Stop making this more difficult." More difficult. Like abandoning. Your child was somehow stressful for them. I turned toward my father with tears pouring down my face. "Dad, please. Please don't leave me here." And then he said the sentence that haunted me for almost 20 years. "Your sister has a future," he said flatly. "You need People trained to deal with children like you. Children like you. I can still hear those words perfectly. A staff member gently held my shoulders while I screamed and cried as my parents walked away. Serena was sobbing uncontrollably in the back seat, one hand pressed against the window as the car pulled away from the curb. Neither of my parents looked back. And just like that, I stopped being their daughter. I became their problem removed from sight. For the first week at Harbor House, I slept in my shoes because I genuinely believed they would come back for me during the night. Every sound outside made me sit up hopefully. Every phone ringing downstairs made my heart race. I wrote letters constantly. I apologized for my grades. I promised to stop drawing. I promised to become smarter. I promised to become whoever they wanted. None of the letters got answered. Then one afternoon, a staff member quietly handed one back to me. Across the envelope was a red stamped mark. Returned to sender. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a light shutting off in a room nobody planned to enter again. And that was only the beginning. Harbor House wasn't abusive, but it was the loneliest place I had ever seen. The building always smelled faintly like old carpet, cafeteria food, and disinfectant. Some kids there had parents in prison, some had been removed from dangerous homes, others had families who simply disappeared one day and never came back. And then there was me, the girl whose parents were still alive, wealthy, respected, and teaching other families how to raise successful children while their own daughter slept in a shared room wondering what she had done wrong. For weeks, I kept believing my parents would change their minds. Every time the front office phone rang, my stomach tightened with hope. Every time someone called my name, I thought maybe my mother had finally come back. But the calls never came. The letters I mailed home were either ignored or returned unopened. I apologized for everything in those letters. I apologized for my grades. I apologized for embarrassing them. I even promised to stop drawing stories in my notebooks if they would just let me come home. Looking back now, the most painful part is realizing an 11-year-old child thought she had to bargain for love. The only connection I had left to my old life was Serena. Months after I arrived at Harbor House, a counselor quietly handed me an envelope during my birthday week. Inside was a handmade card with 2 tiny stars drawn on the front. Underneath, Serena had written only one sentence. "I'm still your twin." I must have read that card 100 times that night. I slept holding it against my chest because it was the only proof that someone from my old life still remembered I existed. My parents were invited to reunification meetings during my first year there, but they barely participated. The first meeting was missed because my father claimed he had a conference. The second because Serena had an academic competition. By the third meeting, they stopped pretending entirely. One social worker quietly showed me part of an email where my father wrote that I was adjusting better away from home pressures and should remain in specialized care. Specialized care. Adults always invent gentle phrases for cruel decisions. After that, something inside me changed. I stopped asking when I could go home because deep down I already knew the answer. I became quieter, smaller, invisible. I still wrote stories, but I hid the pages under my mattress because my parents had spent years teaching me creativity was something embarrassing. Every time I drew characters or imagined worlds, I could still hear my father's voice calling it wasted potential. Then one Saturday afternoon, everything slowly began changing because of a woman named Ruth Brooks. Ruth volunteered at Harbor House through a literacy outreach program. She was older, with silver hair tied loosely behind her head and reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose while she spoke. Most volunteers tried too hard to sound cheerful around us kids, like they were afraid silence would make them uncomfortable. Ruth wasn't like that. She sat beside me quietly during reading hour and noticed a notebook sticking out from under. My sleeve. I immediately tried hiding it because I expected criticism. Instead, she smiled gently and asked, "Do you write stories?" I shrugged without looking at her. "Sometimes." "Well," she said softly, "when you're ready, I'd be honored to read one." Honored. No adult had ever used that word for anything I created before. The next weekend, she returned with her husband Miguel. He was a quiet man with rough mechanic hands, calm eyes, and the kind of presence that made nervous people feel safe without needing many words. While the other volunteers organized activities, Miguel noticed the broken cassette recorder sitting unused in the corner of the recreation room. He quietly took it apart with a screwdriver from his pocket, fixed something inside it, and handed it back to me with a small smile. "Writers need tools too," he said. "That recorder changed my life more than he probably realized." Writing sometimes felt overwhelming because my thoughts moved faster than my hands, but speaking stories aloud felt easier, safer. So I started recording my ideas instead. Fantasy worlds, little adventures, characters who felt abandoned and invisible, just like I did. Ruth listened to every single tape carefully. She didn't laugh. She didn't correct me. She asked questions about the characters, their feelings, their fears. For the first time in my life, an adult treated my imagination like it mattered. Over the next few months, Ruth and Miguel became the only adults I truly trusted. They visited constantly, never making promises they couldn't keep. That's why I didn't believe them at first when Ruth sat beside me one afternoon and quietly said they were applying to become my foster parents. I remember staring at her in complete disbelief. "You mean temporarily?" Her eyes softened immediately. "Only if that's what you want, Elena." Nobody had asked me what I wanted in a very long time. The process took months. There were interviews, home visits, evaluations, court meetings. My biological parents barely participated except through lawyers and short emails. My father referred to me as a complex child requiring alternative support structures. Not his daughter. Not Elena. Just a problem explained in professional language. Ruth cried after reading one of those emails. Miguel sat quietly at their kitchen table that night and said something I never forgot. "A child isn't a project you throw away because it became difficult." When I finally moved into their small Sacramento home, it felt nothing like the Hartley house. The furniture didn't match perfectly. Books were stacked everywhere. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cinnamon most mornings. Miguel repaired old bicycles for neighborhood kids in the garage, while Ruth spent evenings reading beside the window. It wasn't fancy or impressive, but for the first time in years, I felt safe. The strangest part was how ordinary their love felt. Nobody compared me to Serena. Nobody turned grades into a measure of worth. When I brought home a B- on a reading assignment, I spent the entire walk home terrified Ruth would be disappointed. Instead, she smiled proudly and taped it to the refrigerator because my teacher had written "excellent improvement" across the top. I stood there staring at that fridge for almost 10 minutes because my brain genuinely couldn't process what unconditional support looked like. Eventually, my biological parents signed away their parental rights completely. No emotional goodbye, no apology, no explanation. Just paperwork handled through attorneys like they were closing an unwanted business account. Ruth and Miguel asked if I wanted to keep the Hartley name or choose theirs instead. I chose Brooks immediately, because Hartley was the name of people who abandoned me. Brooks became the name of people who stayed. Healing didn't happen all at once after I became Elena Brooks. People love stories where one kind family suddenly fixes everything, but real trauma doesn't disappear that easily. Even after moving in with Ruth and Miguel, I still carried my parents' voices around inside my head. Every test made my stomach twist with panic. Every mistake felt dangerous. Sometimes Ruth would compliment something I created, and my first instinct would be to assume she was only being nice because she felt sorry for me. But Ruth and Miguel never rushed me. They never acted frustrated when I struggled emotionally. Ruth taught me something I had never experienced before: patience. Not the fake patience adults use while secretly annoyed, but real patience. The kind that waits without making you feel guilty for needing time. She would sit beside me for hours while I rewrote stories or stumbled through homework, calmly reminding me that learning wasn't supposed to feel like punishment. Miguel taught me something different. He taught me that broken things weren't worthless. Every weekend, he repaired old bicycles, radios, cassette players, and kitchen appliances people were ready to throw away. Sometimes I'd sit quietly in the garage watching him work while soft music played from an old speaker nearby. One afternoon, I asked him why he bothered fixing things most people would replace. Without looking up from the bicycle chain in his hands, he smiled slightly and said, "Because being damaged and being useless aren't the same thing." I don't think he realized how deeply that sentence hit me. High school became the first place where I slowly started discovering who I actually was outside my parents' expectations. I joined the student radio club because speaking into a microphone felt safer than standing in front of people face to face. Something about recording my voice in a quiet room made my thoughts come easier. I started creating little story programs for younger students at the local library where Ruth worked. Some kids struggled with reading. Others had ADHD, dyslexia, anxiety, speech delays, or learning differences teachers didn't fully understand. And every time I looked at them, I saw pieces of myself. I recognized that defeated look in their eyes immediately, the look children get after hearing they're lazy, difficult, distracted, or not trying hard enough. So I started experimenting. Instead of forcing kids to memorize boring worksheets, I turned lessons into stories. Vocabulary became adventure games. Reading became role play. Math problems became mysteries kids solved together through sound effects and storytelling. I noticed something incredible happening almost immediately. Kids who usually shut down during lessons suddenly leaned forward excitedly. Children who thought they were stupid began participating because they finally felt understood instead of judged. For the first time in my life, something that came naturally to me actually mattered. By college, I knew exactly what I wanted to study. I moved to Washington State and focused on child development, communication, and instructional design. I was never the perfect straight-A student people like my parents admired. But professors remembered me because I could explain difficult ideas in ways that emotionally connected with people. I understood struggling learners because I had once been treated like one myself. Around that same time, Serena and I finally started rebuilding our relationship properly. Once she turned 18, our parents couldn't control her communication anymore. She started calling regularly, sometimes late at night after exhausting academic events or internships. On the surface, she had become everything my parents wanted: successful, polished, brilliant. But underneath all that achievement, I could hear how emotionally exhausted she really was. One night during a phone call, she quietly admitted something that broke my heart. "They only love me when I succeed," she whispered. "I'm terrified of disappointing them." That was the moment I realized my parents had damaged both of us differently. I had grown up feeling rejected. Serena had grown up feeling trapped under impossible expectations. Neither experience was healthy. Neither was love. During college, I also met Caleb Reed through a volunteer literacy program. Caleb was studying speech-language therapy, and unlike most people, he never treated my past like some tragic inspirational story. He listened carefully without trying to fix me. He understood children who communicated differently, struggled differently, learned differently. We spent hours talking about education systems, anxiety, creativity, and how many children get mislabeled simply because adults only value one type of intelligence. Slowly, he became my safest place. After graduation, Caleb and I got married in Ruth and Miguel's backyard, surrounded by fairy lights, folding chairs, homemade food, and the people who actually loved us. Serena stood beside me during the ceremony, crying through half the vows. Our biological parents weren't invited. They didn't even know it happened. A few months later, Caleb and I moved to Seattle and started building the project that would eventually change my life completely. We called it BrightBridge. At first, it was tiny. Just community workshops and public libraries and donated classrooms where we worked with children who had been labeled slow, difficult, average, or not gifted enough. We had almost no money. I designed lesson materials by hand at our kitchen table while Caleb helped children with communication challenges and processing difficulties. Ruth organized reading circles. Miguel drove boxes of secondhand supplies from Sacramento in his old truck whenever we needed help. But what made BrightBridge different was simple. We adapted learning to the child instead of forcing the child to adapt through shame. And kids responded immediately. I still remember one little boy named Marcus who struggled with dyslexia so badly he refused to read aloud at school. Teachers thought he was lazy because he acted out whenever reading assignments started. During one of our sessions, Caleb suggested letting Marcus record himself privately instead of reading in front of others. So we handed him headphones and a microphone. The first time he successfully read an entire paragraph aloud into that microphone. He stopped halfway through and stared at us in disbelief. "I did it?" he whispered. His mother started crying so hard she had to sit down. Moments like that spread quickly through parents, teachers, and local communities. Videos from our workshops started appearing online. Then education blogs mentioned us, then podcasts, then local news stations. Within 3 years, BrightBridge expanded into a nationally recognized educational program helping children who traditional systems often ignored. And suddenly, the same world that once treated me like a disappointment began calling me inspirational. But success felt complicated because somewhere out there, my biological parents were still alive, still respected, still pretending they had made the right choice, abandoning one daughter to preserve the image of the other. Then one morning, everything changed. I received an invitation to appear on a national television program called American Morning Desk after BrightBridge won a major education innovation award. The interview itself felt surreal. Bright studio lights, makeup artists rushing around, producers counting down in headsets while cameras moved silently across the stage. The host eventually smiled at me and asked, "What inspired all of this?" For a second, every painful memory flashed through my head at once. Harbor House, returned letters, my father calling me a failed investment, my mother refusing to look at me while I begged not to be left behind. But instead of attacking them publicly, I simply answered honestly. I was once made to feel like I wasn't worth believing in, I said quietly. Then 2 people taught me every child learns differently and every child deserves someone who stays. The cameras immediately cut toward Ruth and Miguel sitting in the audience. Ruth was crying openly. Miguel looked emotional too, though he tried hiding it. Caleb squeezed my hand proudly backstage. Millions of people watched that interview, including my biological parents, and 3 days later, after nearly 2 decades of silence, they suddenly remembered I existed. The first message from my parents appeared while I was sitting in my office reviewing scholarship applications for BrightBridge students. I remember staring at my phone so long the screen dimmed twice before I finally opened it. The message sounded warm, polished, almost emotional. My mother wrote that they had seen me on national television and were so proud of the woman I had become. My father added that perhaps enough time had passed for us to reconnect as a family. I read the message 3 times, waiting for the apology that never came. There was no mention of Harbor House, no mention of the letters they ignored, no mention of the reunification meetings they skipped, or the moment they looked at their 11-year-old. daughter and decided she wasn't worth the effort anymore. They spoke as if we had simply drifted apart naturally instead of them abandoning me because I wasn't academically impressive enough. At first, I wanted to delete the message immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe anger. Maybe I simply wanted to see whether they were capable of telling the truth if forced into the same room with it. So instead of blocking them, I called Serena. The moment she answered, she sighed heavily and said, "They contacted you too, didn't they?" That was how I learned the real reason behind their sudden interest. Hartley Gifted Institute was struggling badly. Former students had started speaking publicly about burnout, anxiety disorders, emotional pressure, and mental health damage caused by the institute's extreme expectations. A few education journalists were investigating whether gifted coaching, programs like my father's, created toxic environments for children. Sponsors were nervous. Investors were nervous. My parents needed a redemption story desperately. And then I appeared on national television. According to Serena, my mother had literally described me as an unconventional success story the family could reclaim. Reclaim. Like I was a brand they temporarily lost ownership of. My father apparently believed the public would love the narrative of a misunderstood daughter returning triumphantly to her accomplished family. Not once did they discuss apologizing. Not once did they discuss accountability, only image, only reputation, only strategy. That night, Caleb found me sitting silently at our kitchen table, staring at my phone while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. He didn't tell me what decision to make. He simply sat beside me and asked one question. What would actually give you peace? And after thinking about it for a long time, I realized something important. I didn't want revenge built on screaming or humiliation. I didn't want some dramatic public meltdown. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth to stand in the same room as the people who spent years hiding from it. So I invited my parents to dinner, and then I invited Ruth and Miguel too. Serena immediately booked a flight to Seattle after I told her my plan. "If they try rewriting history," she said firmly, "I want to be there when the truth finally catches up to them." The entire week leading up to the dinner felt strangely calm, not because I wasn't nervous, but because for the first time in my life I wasn't scared of my parents anymore. I gathered old documents quietly, adoption papers, reunification records, returned letters, and one printed email where my father referred to me as a child they could no longer reasonably invest in. Caleb helped prepare a short video showing Brightbridge workshops, children learning through storytelling, Ruth leading literacy circles, and Miguel setting up donated equipment for struggling students. None of it was exaggerated. None of it was fake. That's what made it powerful. Saturday evening finally arrived cold and rainy. My parents showed up carrying expensive flowers and a bottle of wine like they were attending some elegant reunion instead of walking into the wreckage of their own choices. My mother hugged me tightly the second I opened the door, but it felt performative, almost rehearsed, like she was already imagining photographs being taken later. "You look beautiful, Elena," she said softly. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry." My father stepped inside, looking around my house carefully. "You've done very well for yourself," he commented with the same tone businessmen use while evaluating successful investments. "For yourself," as if nobody else helped build the life standing around him. When they entered the dining room, they immediately noticed Serena sitting at the table. Genuine surprise flashed across their faces because they clearly assumed she would remain loyal to them no matter what. But what they didn't notice at first were Ruth and Miguel seated quietly, farther down the table. People like my parents rarely noticed ordinary people until those people became impossible to ignore. Dinner started painfully polite. Every clink of silverware sounded too loud. My mother kept complimenting the house, the food, the furniture, anything that avoided discussing the past. My father asked detailed questions about Brightbridge's expansion plans, partnerships, funding, and public visibility. He wasn't speaking like a father reconnecting with his daughter. He sounded like a man studying a valuable company. Then finally, halfway through dinner, my mother placed her hand gently over mine. "Elena," she said carefully, "the world saw you on television. Maybe this is the right time for healing. People deserve to know your full family story." I stared at her hand for a moment, remembering the last time I held onto it as a terrified child begging not to be abandoned. Then I asked quietly, "Which story would that be?" My father cleared his throat immediately. "The story of resilience, of high standards producing success through unconventional paths." Serena looked physically sick hearing him say that, but he kept going. "We're hosting a gala next month. Having you there beside the family could really help people understand where your foundation came from." Foundation. That word finally broke something loose inside me. I stood slowly, from my chair holding my wine glass tightly because my hands were starting to shake. The room became painfully quiet. "You're right," I said calmly. "Success does begin with a foundation. So before anyone discusses family stories publicly, I think it's important to acknowledge the people who actually built mine." My mother's expression changed instantly. I turned toward Ruth first. "When I was 11 years old," I said softly, "I believed I was too difficult to love. Ruth found me at Harbor House hiding stories under my sleeve because I thought creativity was something shameful. Instead of asking what was wrong with me, she asked if she could read my work." Ruth immediately covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Then I looked toward Miguel. Miguel fixed a broken cassette recorder so I could speak my stories aloud when writing felt too hard. He taught me broken things aren't worthless just because they need patience. My father's jaw tightened. I thanked Caleb for helping. Me turned childhood pain into a program protecting children from feeling the same shame I once felt. I thanked Serena for loving me quietly, even when she was too young to stop what happened. And finally, I looked directly at my biological parents. "And since you both recently told me how proud you are of my success," I continued quietly, "I thought tonight would be the perfect opportunity for you to finally meet the people who actually raised me." The silence after that felt suffocating. My mother slowly turned toward Ruth with confusion spreading across her face. And then sudden recognition hit her hard. Years earlier, Ruth had publicly challenged my mother during an education panel discussion, criticizing the idea that children's worth could be measured through gifted testing alone. I still remember my mother mocking her afterward as an emotional librarian who confuses kindness with expertise. Now that same woman sat across from her as the mother who rebuilt the daughter she discarded. My father recognized Miguel seconds later, too. Years ago, Miguel worked maintenance for a school district connected to Hartley programs. My father once dismissed him publicly by saying, "Some people fix engines, others shape futures." Now he was staring at the man who shaped mine after he failed to. "This is inappropriate," my mother whispered shakily. "No," Serena said suddenly, her voice trembling with anger. "What you did was inappropriate." My father stood halfway from his chair looking furious now. "We made difficult decisions, based on professional recommendations." I calmly opened the folder beside my plate and slid one printed email across the table. "Serena is the child we can still invest in," it read. "Elena requires a different environment." My father went completely pale. I didn't yell. I didn't insult them. I simply looked at them and said the truth they spent 18 years avoiding. "I was a child," I said quietly. "Not a failed investment. Not a reputation problem. A child." After that, Caleb quietly pressed play on the video we had prepared. The screen showed children sitting in Brightbridge workshops reading stories, into microphones, laughing during lessons, drawing maps for imaginary worlds, and slowly gaining confidence instead of fear. It showed Ruth helping nervous kids through reading circles. It showed Miguel carrying donated books into community centers and fixing old computers for children who couldn't afford new ones. And over the final clip, my voice played softly, saying, "No child is average when someone takes the time to understand how they learn." By the time the video ended, my mother was crying quietly. But even then, her first real response wasn't about me. It wasn't about regret. It wasn't even about what they had done. It was about themselves. "Do you understand what this could do to us?" she whispered. And honestly, that was the moment every last piece of hope finally died inside me. Because even after everything, they still cared more about their reputation than the little girl they abandoned. "That," I said calmly, "is the first honest thing you've said all night." My father pushed his chair back aggressively and stood up. His face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. "You invited us here to humiliate us." "No," Serena said before I could answer. "She invited you here to tell the truth." For a second, nobody moved. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the silence inside the room felt painfully heavy. Then my parents grabbed their things and walked toward the door without touching dessert, without apologizing, without even looking properly at the people who spent years loving the daughter they threw away. Right before leaving, my father turned back toward me one last time. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. But for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't scared of him. After they left, Ruth hugged me so tightly I almost broke down completely. Miguel rested one hand on my shoulder and quietly said, "You did nothing wrong." And hearing those words from him healed something inside me more than revenge ever could. I thought the story ended there. I was wrong. The very next morning, Hartley Gifted Institute released a public statement online claiming I had manipulated the dinner to punish grieving parents who made difficult decisions during a challenging period. They painted themselves as heartbroken victims trying to reconnect with their estranged daughter. But they made one massive mistake. They pushed too hard. Instead of staying quiet, they tagged education reporters, sponsors, television programs, and organizations connected to Bright Bridge because they thought public pressure would scare me into silence. The 11-year-old version of me probably would have panicked. The 29-year-old version didn't. I posted one calm response with evidence attached. I explained that I had been abandoned at 11 after failing to meet my parents' academic expectations. I explained that Ruth and Miguel fostered and later adopted me after my biological parents stopped participating in reunification efforts. Then I ended the post with one sentence that spread across social media faster than anything else. I was not raised by high standards. I was rescued by consistent love. And then Serena did something nobody expected. She publicly supported me. She admitted she had been the favored twin. She admitted our parents treated children like reflections of success instead of human beings. And because she had always been their perfect daughter, people listened. Former students from Hartley Institute started sharing their own stories about pressure, anxiety, breakdowns, and emotional damage. Sponsors pulled away. Journalists started investigating. My father resigned from advisory boards. My mother lost speaking invitations about child development and academic parenting. Their empire didn't collapse because of lies. It collapsed because the truth finally became public. A few weeks later, my father sent one final message blaming me for destroying the family name. My mother sent another asking if I was finally satisfied now that their reputation was damaged. I looked at both messages for a long time, waiting to feel guilt. Instead, I felt peace. Because after spending most of my life begging those people to love me, I finally understood something important. Their approval was never the thing that gave me value. Ruth and Miguel gave me something far greater than success. They gave me safety, patience, belonging. They taught me that love isn't supposed to disappear when performance does. Today, Brightbridge helps thousands of children across the country. Serena remains close to me. Caleb still reminds me to slow down whenever work consumes too much of my life. Ruth still cries during emotional movies. Miguel still fixes broken things in his garage. And sometimes I think about the little girl standing outside Harbor House watching her parents drive away believing her life was over. She had no idea that losing the wrong family would eventually lead her to the right one. If this story hit you emotionally, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Do you believe some parents care more about success than love? And as always, stay tuned for more unforgettable Reddit revenge stories.